Okay, in this segment we are going to talk about import and export rules and some general information about importing and exporting. So first of all, to begin with, in your normal, average, general consumer goods type of transaction, if you're going to be exporting goods out of the United States, for the most part, you do not need to require or get specific approval or licensing or permitting from the government. So that's going to apply to your most everyday goods, shampoo or flour, your normal consumer type goods that really don't have any applications other than normal retail consumer type activity. Now, when you have other type of goods that are going to be exported, so for example, it might include hydraulic fluid that you use in a tractor for farming or for construction like bulldozers. Hydraulic fluid could also be used in a military setting, of course, for heavy equipment and tanks and armaments. So there are areas where there are dual use type of products that may require licensing, and then there are other areas where you're just flat out, you have to have a permit or approval from the government to be able to export your goods. So the control, and it's on page 72. I'm going to post this on our site too if you want to go to coffee or something. It's up to you. Your call. So the governmental agency, when we're talking about exporting rules and the approvals that you might have to get to export goods out of the United States, there are a number of different governmental agencies, but one of the most important is the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is abbreviated as BIS, and that's a sub-branch of the United States Department of Commerce. And that is a branch of the government that regulates importing and exporting, and also regulates potential countries or people that you may not be able to engage in business or importing and exporting transactions or other type of transactions. So next page over, 73. So there are certain areas where if you're going to be exporting goods out of the U.S., you will likely have to have a license or approval from one of the various different governmental agencies, or perhaps more than one, that are involved in import and export rules and regulations. So these are areas, for example, obviously national security, so military, armaments and components, military type equipment that have national security implications are highly regulated, and you will need, in most cases, a license or a permit to be able to export those goods or import them, depending on the situation. Foreign policy situation where due to current foreign policy or things going on in the world, there may be economic sanctions or other type of prohibitions on importing and exporting goods from either a specific country or a region, or individual people or companies or financial institutions. And that's regulated, I'll show you in a minute, through the SDN list, or the Specially Designated Nationals list. If there are areas where there are short supply due to economic reasons or weather conditions or whatever, those may be regulated and require a license or a permit. If you have a situation where a hurricane or something wiped out a crop, there may be regulations that would limit the ability to export goods because the domestic supply was in a short circumstance, or oil or other type of areas. Nuclear non-proliferation. This involves any type of product that has any radiological or nuclear components to it. Obviously, anything that's going to be used for atomic energy is highly regulated. But you might see this also in an area where you're trying to export, for example, medical equipment, X-ray machines, MRIs, and other type of medical equipment that is going to be used for, medical purposes, but they do have radiological components to them. We also see that in areas where you may have like ground penetrating radar and construction that may have radiological components involved in the equipment. You also see that in archaeology. They use those type of ground penetrating radar. And so that may require you to obtain approvals to be able to take it out of the country or export it for sale, depending on the situation. Any missile technology or other type of guidance, so this can include navigational, GPS, other type of satellite telemetry products that may have dual use capability. They may be used, obviously for private aircraft or even commercial passenger aircraft, but that also has potential overlap into military application. And so anything that could be used for guidance or navigational purposes may be regulated depending on the power and the use of that type of product. Anything involving chemical and biological weapons or components that could be used to make them, highly regulated. Anything involving regional stability, crime control, terroristic activity or that sort of thing, obviously is going to be circumstantial depending on the circumstances and situation at the time. And these are all fluid things. They change all the time depending on what's going on in the world, obviously. And then finally we have cultural or historical items on this list here, and that is essentially prohibition and rules that prohibit trade or exporting or importing certain type of goods that may be from endangered species like tortoise shell or ivory from an elephant or a rhinoceros horn or something of that nature, or anything archaeological, Native American artifacts or other type of antiquities may be either flat out prohibited or may require a special license. And that would include, even if you're a museum or other type of philanthropic activity, you still may have to get permissions depending on what your activities are going to involve. So this is all leading up to this idea that when you're engaged in importing and exporting, either for commercial purposes, for personal use purposes, or for non-commercial purposes, including charitable or other type of activities, you need to research ahead of time to make sure that what you're going to be importing or exporting is not controlled or prohibited, and the people that you're going to be working with are not on a prohibited list, or you're not going to be exporting to countries that are prohibited. That's all research you need to do ahead of time before you start engaging in these activities. So, one of the ways that you do your background researching is to look into the type of product that you're going to be exporting, and this will involve what we call an export control classification number, or abbreviated an ECCN. This is a number that is issued for virtually every product that you can think of that you use in your everyday life, or that you might buy at a store, but also products that are used in commercial, industrial, and military type applications. And the idea of this number is to establish a standardized list of product identification, so that is used for various purposes. One purpose is to determine what licensing or permitting you might need from a governmental agency, to determine if you have just blanket authority to be able to export goods like consumer goods, which generally don't require a license. And that will all depend on the classification for that specific type of product. Now these get really, really detailed. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but just to give you a general idea of what we're talking about. So this is what an ECCN number looks like. So this is an export control classification number, or abbreviated ECCN. And it looks something like this. You have a number here, and then you have a letter, and then you have another number. And these correspond to the exact product down to the minute detail of the composition of the product, which may depend on a number of different factors. So essentially it looks like this. First number is going to be the broad control category list. So this first number right here, so here it's 3. You see, 3A001. So 3 is electronics. So this is the general list of the first number in an ECCN, and that will be the broad overall category for that type of product. So 3 is for electronics, 4 for computers, 5 telecommunications, navigation and avionics under number 7, on down the line. So that's that first number. So you're going to look for your broad category number for the type of product that you're going to be exporting. And then the next is a letter. And this will break down into different product groups within that broad category of the first number. So A are systems, equipment, and components. B are testing, inspection, and production equipment, material, software, and technology. So if we look at this ECCN number again, the first number is going to be that broad category. The second number is going to be a subcategory of the type of subcategory it fits into. So in this case, it would be 3 for electronics, A for electronic system, equipment, and components. And then the second number is going to be a number that corresponds to a very specific description for the type of product that you're exporting. It might be a computer chip, or it might be a motherboard for a computer, or an LED screen. Whatever the case may be, it's going to have a very specific number for that type of product. Now, some products fall under a general consumer products category, and those are generally going to be, it's called an EAR, which allows for the product to be exported without any special approvals. They generally have pre-approval based upon the ECCN number for that product. So again, when you're researching and trying to look into what rules may limit your ability to export, you're going to start with the ECCN number for the type of product that you have. Now, sometimes your product may fall under what appears to be various categories, and it's not real clear. You do your research on Google and whatnot to see if you can find an ECCN number from other exporters. That's one way to look it up. And then if you really can't find it, call the Bureau of the BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security. Sorry, I had a little lapse there. The BIS, and they actually have staff that will help work your way through the ECCN number classification. I've actually had to call them before to look up a hydraulic fluid product, and they were very, very helpful in helping me out with that out of the San Francisco office at the time. That was several years ago. But okay, so when we talk about export licensing, so on page 76, there are 4 primary governmental agencies, and then there are sub-units below these agencies. And there are potentially more than this, but these are the main 4: the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, the Department of State, and the Department of Treasury. And these are the various different bureaucracy agencies that control or may impose restrictions on trade in certain type of goods or products. And they also have put together various lists of controlled export products. So one of them is called the Commerce Control List, the CCL, which is administered by the Commerce Department. And that's a list of products that may be prohibited or may have various trade restrictions. Then we have the USML, which is the U.S. Munitions List, which is administered by the State Department. And that will be a list of prohibited or severely limited products that may involve ammunition or other type of militarized potential weaponry. We also have anything that's nuclear is going to be under the atomic energy. Anything like that's going to be regulated as well. So I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but these are all things that you're going to want to research when you're going to be looking into doing an export. So when you're researching potential exporting, one of the places that you're going to want to look is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, otherwise known as OFAC. So the issue is, are there countries or people for which you are prohibited by law from importing or exporting and engaging in those type of transactions? And so we have the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is administered by the Treasury Department. And the reason that they're important is they are in charge of putting together information about potential countries or regions for which it is illegal or highly restricted importing or exporting of goods. And they will regulate and prohibit certain countries. And they also put together lists of people that you are prohibited from engaging in business or even charitable activity, which is called the Specially Designated Asset List. So that's where you want to start, with the Treasury Department. And I'll just show you what I'm talking about here. Let me switch over to the computer real quick. Okay, so this is the U.S. Department of Treasury website, and you can see here sanctions program and country information under OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, and these are a list of active sanction programs that we currently have as of 2022. And so you can go Afghanistan, the Balkan region, Belarus, and then other type of sanctions. Here's where we'd find Cuba, and they're going to be more detailed as you look into what specific sanctions there are. And it gets very detailed, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time on it. But this is where you would go look to determine, first of all, am I authorized to be able to even engage in importing or exporting activity with this specific country or region, depending on the specific guidance that you would look up. And again, these change very frequently, so just because it was legitimate or illegal yesterday, that things may have changed. So it's always important to stay current when you're researching those type of exporting activities. Now the next important area when you're looking at engaging in importing and exporting activity is whether or not the end user, that is, who you're selling to or buying from, or otherwise engaging in business activity on a contract or agent or representative type basis, are there entities or persons for which you're not permitted to export or otherwise engage in activity? So, apologize for all the words on this. This was a cut and paste off the website. So this leads us to the SDN, or Specially Designated Nationals list. This is a list that is developed by the Treasury Department through the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, of people or entities, which may include corporations or LLCs or nonprofits or NGOs or IGOs, just depending on the circumstance, that have been designated as unlawful to engage in transactions, and this may be for various reasons, which may include terrorism or other type of insurrection activity, or other activity related to specific political sanctions that are currently going on at the time. And so this is a list that changes constantly. And so it's something you're going to want to make sure that you go on the website and look it up to make sure that you're using the most current information. So let me just show you what it looks like real quick. All right, so this is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list. as of March 7th, 2022. And let me blow that up a little bit here. So I don't know if you can see on the video, but this is 1,706 pages long. So this is a big, big list. And again, it changes constantly. They do have a search function, so you don't have to go through the whole list. But even with the search function, it's a good idea even just to double check it by looking at the list. So just to show you, kind of what it looks like. So here we have the Second Academy of Natural Sciences, also known as the Academy of Natural Sciences, and they have various different other AKAs out of North Korea. So if you are, working with a representative from this entity, that would be unlawful under the list as of the date of publication. And then it just goes on alphabetically, numerically from there. So you can just see here, it's very, very detailed. And again, you may have a situation where the person or company that you're contemplating engaging into an export agreement with, you're going to want to look on this list. There may be similar names, so sometimes that may be hard to track down. At the end of the day, if you are not sure, you would want to contact the Office of Foreign Asset Control to have them give you specific guidance to determine if the people or other entities that you might be working with are on this type of list that would be prohibited. So that's the SDN, or again, Specially Designated Nationals list. All right, so next let's talk about some other issues involving import and export. This is on page 78 of our Blue Book. So if you're engaging in importing and exporting, you could try to do a lot of this yourself, but it may be overwhelming, or you may find that it's better to utilize your time elsewhere. So there are companies that will help you assist in making these determinations, the ECCN number, sanctions, and that kind of thing. And one of them would be a freight forwarding company. This is a company that engages in business activity to assist people with export documentation, shipping requirements, and acting as a shipping agent, making arrangements for transportation, customs, and all of that type of thing. Oftentimes, if it involves maritime, they're going to be regulated. So you could engage the services of a freight forwarder to assist you with your transaction. Why would you use a freight forwarder? The weight of the cargo, basically the freight forwarder will take care of the cargo from dock to door, as I've indicated here on this slide. That may include filing of export documentation, arrangements with carriers, packing, crating, storage, and other type of activity involved in the shipping of the product that you want to export. Similar is a customs broker, and they may be the same person. You may have a freight forwarder who's also acting as a customs broker, but the term custom broker broadly refers to an entity, a person that performs transactions at ports of entry on behalf of other parties, or acting as an agent to help your products get through customs inspections, tariff, and other type of border control trade barriers for products. And so you have a freight forwarder that's going to assist you with your transportation and activity of that nature, and then you have a customs broker that will assist you in taking care of getting your goods across the border, and all the requirements and regulations for that type of product, and that sort of thing. Okay, let's move on a little bit here. Another issue, are rules of origin. The term rules of origin broadly refers to the idea of rules. Some of this is under the World Trade Organization, some of it's through treaty outside of the WTO. Some of this may involve free trade agreements. So rules of origin are rules that are set by a treaty that establish how you determine the country of origin for a specific product. And this will typically also include the issuance of a certificate of origin or various different names for the same idea that may be issued by the Chamber of Commerce in a particular country that you're in, or a governmental entity or other type of inspection company, depending where you're at. And these are basically the rules that will establish, for purposes of imposing tariffs, taxes, sanctions, and other type of country-specific related issues, where that product is from. Now, the way that this comes into play, for example, let's say it's a laptop computer, and we're going to have a keyboard, we're going to have the display screen, you're going to have the plastic shell, you're going to have the hard drive, the motherboard, and the other components that you have in a laptop computer. Well, those all get assembled and put into the final version that's ready to be boxed up and sent out for sale. So you may have components coming from multiple different countries that are then assembled perhaps in a free port or a free trade zone, and then exported out for purposes of sale to the retail public. And so the question is, you have all these different products which may be from different countries as component products. They're then assembled, made into a laptop, packaged up for retail sale, and then they're shipped out. So what is the country of origin for that? Is it where the component manufacturers are from, or is it where it was finally assembled? And this is what I mean by the rules of origin. And that will be determined by WTO rules and other treaties. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of it, but it is an issue. And again, as we talked about in a different segment, this is also important for letter of credit purposes. If you want to get paid as the seller, you're going to have to provide a certificate of origin to comply with a letter of credit requirement. And that will all come from, depending on where you're located, Chamber of Commerce or other type of agency or entity that issues them. Or it may come from the manufacturer themselves. Another area involving import and export law are what are called pre-shipment inspections. A pre-shipment inspection is any type of an inspection regime that requires inspection before the goods are exported out of a country or before they are going to be able to clear customs in the country where you're importing into. And this is an area where we do have WTO rules, and part of this has to do with using pre-shipment inspections as a form of a non-tariff trade barrier. This is the idea that pre-shipment inspections must be non-discriminatory, again, under WTO rules. That's one of the primary ideas of the WTO is non-discriminatory conduct, treating of products from other WTO member countries equally with your own products. And that includes these type of inspections because they could be used, if you put up very burdensome pre-shipment inspections on a particular country that you don't apply to other countries for the same product, that is discriminatory. And that could be used as a political tool or economic tool to limit trade from a particular country by having very burdensome inspections on that country that you don't otherwise apply to other countries. So they have to be non-discriminatory under WTO rules. All goods from member states must be given no less favorable treatment, meaning you treat everybody the same. They must be carried out in the state of export. Quantity and quality inspections must have set standards, and they must be transparent and available rules so that you know ahead of time what the rules are and be able to look those up and research them. So in other words, they're not made up by the inspector on a day-by-day basis depending on the customer or whatever. You want them to be applied equally. Another issue that you'll run into is certification and engineering standards, consumer standards for consumer products and other electronics and those kind of things. And there are various forms of these. I have here the CE mark, Conformité European, which is a mark that is required to be able to sell products in the European Union under their rules. And this will require you, if you're a manufacturer or an importer or exporter, to make sure that your products, if they fall under the CE rules and regulations in the European Union, you're going to have the product engineered, inspected to be able to get that CE, and that may be expensive and time consuming. There are type of standards which may involve underwriter laboratories or other type of engineering standards, depending on the type of product that you're talking about, electronics or fuel products or whatever. So that's another issue you want to look at, is to make sure that your product that you're going to be importing or exporting or manufacturing, to determine what kind of any certification, engineering, or other type of standards, ISO, et cetera, that may apply to that product, to make sure that your product meets it and you can prove that. Again, you may have to have a certificate stating that your product meets the certification mark requirements as part of your shipping documents, your letter of credit, getting through customs and that kind of thing. Okay, so next let's talk about free zones, and we're talking about, again, importing and exporting. So just as a general idea, a free zone is a term that relates to different geographical areas, which may be a country, the whole country itself, or it might be a designated area within a country, like an industrial park or manufacturing zone or technology zone. It may be a city or part of a city. It could be a port, which might be a maritime port or an airport or other port of entry. It could be a railroad yard or an area where you park containers. So the idea of a free zone, be it a whole country or a limited area, a city or part of an airport, is the idea that within that free zone there are reduced or eliminated barriers to importing and exporting. That could include, for example, reduced imposition or imposing taxes. It could be a reduction in other type of laws that limit foreign ownership or repatriation of profits, other type of restrictions perhaps on foreign workers for immigration and visa purposes. Very common are areas where you have zones that are set up for manufacturing purposes to allow you to bring in your component parts, assemble them into a final product, and then ship them out without having to pay import tariffs on those products, on the component parts. So there are various different rules for this, different ideas. So we have, next one down, some states may open their entire territories for international trade. For example, Singapore, there are special economic zones within China that allow for these type of activities where they reduce or eliminate certain laws and restrictions and taxes to encourage the manufacturing of goods, importing and exporting, assembling, that kind of thing. There are certain cities or ports which also have reduced down or have these flexible laws which allow for the free trade activity within that zone. So for example, this This is an example of a free trade zone within the United Arab Emirates. This is an area that they've set up in the UAE, which allows for business activity to take place within that area. And as you can see here, these are some of the benefits that they offer. 100% foreign ownership, so again, you're not going to have to, if you have local participation or perhaps an agent or form a separate subsidiary within that country, you can have foreign ownership, 100% income and corporate tax exemption, so we're talking about an income tax-free area, so they're not going to tax your income on activity that's generated within that area. 100% capital and profit repatriation, which goes along with a tax exemption. Long-term leases, you get the transparent laws and regulations, and you get the idea. Seaport, international airport facilities, energy, internet access. The idea of these areas, again, is to encourage business activity, manufacturing, component assembly, and that brings, of course, business into that area. With employment, you're hiring local workers. And so, they may be giving away tax exemptions, but the idea is that they're fostering other areas of the economy by engaging in these type of activities. Another type of a free trade zone is a free port. So this is an area within a port, be it a maritime port or airport or other type of port activity, where essentially cargo can be accepted for handling, processing, and reshipment without the imposition of tariffs and taxes. Taxes become payable only if the products are used for consumption within the country, domestically, where the free port is located. They're established to take advantage of trade links and facilitate quick entry and departure of ships, unhampered by lengthy customs regulations. So Macau, Singapore, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, all have these areas. Now, some type of free ports are very specific, related to a certain industrial sector. So for example, next page over, Cyprus has a free port activity. Cyprus is well known for the shipbuilding industry. And the idea is to encourage maritime activity, building of ships, repairing of ships, retrofitting, that kind of thing. And so basically the concept of a free port is the idea that, let's say I'm going to build a giant cargo container ship, 1,000 feet long. So you have all the steel, the motors that are going to go into the ship, the navigation systems and other electronics, all of the cranes and winches and all the components that are going to be needed to build that huge ship. Now, obviously, those are going to be very expensive, and if you're building that ship, you're going to import a lot of those products, the big motors and everything else from other countries. So if you're a manufacturer, you don't want to have to pay taxes, import taxes, on those component parts. Because if you have to pay tax on the value of the ship motors and the electronics and the steel and everything else, that's going to increase the cost of the ship. And so the idea is that you can bring those components in, build a ship, and then so long as that ship is not going to be used domestically or going to export it, then there won't be any taxes. So building, repair, and assembly of all kinds of ships, banking and insurance services, all with the idea of helping to develop the manufacturing component and sector within that economy. And this also typically will include the manufacturing facilities themselves. So again, if you think about shipbuilding, or this could be true of automobile production or virtually any type of industry, if I'm going to build a large manufacturing or facility, warehouse, then I'm going to have all the big cranes and lifts and welding equipment and all of the other equipment that you need, forklifts and all that. Those are also expensive. Typically, these ports will also not impose a tax on the components for your facilities, be it a property tax or an import tax, tariff, or other type of tax, to allow you to build your facility with either reduced or totally eliminated taxes on the value of the facility and the equipment and inventory that you're using within that free port or that free trade zone. Now, another area is what's known as a bonded warehouse. So a bonded warehouse is a warehouse, a building basically, where goods and products are be able to stored before the payment of tariffs have been made. The idea is to allow for import and export of goods into this warehouse, and then they're going to be stored in the warehouse until you make a determination on how you're going to use those components. Or maybe you're just using the warehouse as a staging area so that you get all your components, and once they've all arrived, you might then all ship them out to another location for final manufacturing. So the idea of a bonded warehouse is basically a building that you can store goods, either component goods or final retail ready products, until you make a determination on where you're going to ship them out and where you're going to sell them. And while they're being stored within that warehouse, they are not subject to import taxes. So it's sort of like a holding area or a waiting room, kind of. So, say this is the building. This is the building, and we have these domestically in the United States as well. So we have a line in the building here. And I actually have a client of mine from years ago that engaged in these type of activities in the wine and beer industry. Wine and beer is subject to both federal and state tax, depending on where you're going to sell it. And so that's why it's called under bond, because you have to have a bond posted with the taxing agencies. It's like a deposit, money on deposit, to pay those taxes. That's why we call it a bonded warehouse, because they have money on deposit through what's known as a bond that guarantees the payment of the import taxes and tariffs for the products that they engage in. So let's just say this is a building that we're using for storage of wine and beer. So the idea is, on one side of the building, so this side of the building is under bond, which means that you have not yet removed, you brought the products in, for example, 25 cases of wine or beer or whatever, which is normally subject to a tax in the state where you're going to sell it. But so we're going to bring the wine in, and we're not sure yet, we're the winery, where we're going to be selling that wine. It depends on when we get orders from customers. So perhaps some of our wine, let's say we're here in Oregon, it's Oregon wine, perhaps some of it's going to be sent to New York, Florida, California, Alaska, wherever, for final sale to the consumer. That's when the tax would be imposed by the state where you're going to be selling the wine. So we're not sure yet where that wine's going to go. So we ship our wine, and it's held on this side of the warehouse under bond. While it's sitting there, waiting to see where it's going to end up in the final end user, there's no tax that will be owed. Now, in the middle of the building, they have a big fence, and in real world, they probably have a big, giant painted line, and then they have a gate right here. And so, let's say we have some wine that was produced in Oregon, and then we're going to sell it in Oregon. So we take it from under bond to out of the bond. As soon as we go over here, we're going to ship it out within the state of Oregon. We're then going to have to pay the tax. So the idea is that while the products are held in the secure part of the building, until you know where you're going to be selling them, you don't owe the tax. So these are very common around the world for importing and exporting because, again, maybe I build laptop computers. I don't know where they're all going to end up. Some may end up going to the United States. Some may end up going to the European Union. So I'm going to hold those laptop computers in the bonded warehouse until I know where I'm going to ship them. And then when I ship them out, wherever I ship them, that's when I'll have to pay the tax to the country I'm going to export them into. So I gave you an example of a bonded warehouse. Let me find it here. It's on page 86. So this is an example in Thailand of a bonded warehouse where goods can be stored in a bonded warehouse for purpose of re-exportation. They'll be exempt from tax and duties until they've been shipped out. And if you then ship them outside of Thailand, you don't pay anything. If you're going to ship them into Thailand, then you would pay a tax to Thailand at that time. Same thing, here's another example in Canada, in Alberta. A customs bonded warehouse are licensed and regulated and operated by the private sector where goods can be stored duty and tax-free, generally up to 4 years, until they are exported or consumed domestically. So you put your products into the warehouse until you know where you're going to ship them. Some of them may be entered domestically into Canada, at which point you would owe tax to Canada, although that's a free trade area for the United States, so maybe not. But nevertheless, any of those products that are being stored that are going to be exported out of Canada, then you basically have held them there for free for a period of up to 4 years until you export them out. So bonded warehouses, in terms of logistics and supply chain, are one of the areas where you want to make sure that you're utilizing those type of free trade areas for manufacturing and other type of facilities to minimize the taxes. Because otherwise you'd have to pay these import taxes for every country where the components are coming from, where you manufacture and where you package, and you would just have layer upon layer of these import taxes that you could avoid by planning out your supply chain to take advantage of these free trade areas. I have another example in what's called an export processing zone. So for example, in Mexico, they have the Maquiladora program. So this is a zone that may be part of a port or an airport or a city or whatever. And the idea is to allow for the importation of raw goods to then be processed or refined or assembled into final end products, and then exported tax-free while they're being assembled or reduced taxes. And again, kind of the policy behind that from the country standpoint is it helps to develop their infrastructure, bring employment, and that kind of thing. So overall, these are some of the issues you look at when you're importing or exporting. And planning out ahead of time where you are going to be doing your supply chain, manufacturing chain based upon these activities. Now another area that you're going to want to research if you're importing or exporting, manufacturing, assembling, whatever, are free trade agreements. So a free trade agreement is an agreement with a country or a group of countries whereby the countries that are part of the free trade agreement have agreed to either eliminate or greatly reduce taxes and other border control barriers for customs for trade between those countries. So the United States has a number of these. When I put this together, these were the bilateral free trade agreements that we had at the time. So we have Andean Free Trade Agreement, Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Central American Free Trade Agreement, Israel, Jordan, Morocco, Panama. You get the idea. Now again, these may change from time to time, and so the best way is to look them up. And these areas are governed by the U.S. Office of the Trade Representative. And so this is a list of the current free trade agreements that we have with 20 different countries with the U.S. And then you can go click on the link and it will give you more information about what products may be covered by that free trade area, either all products or a certain type of product. And the advantage of this, of course, is if you're engaging in importing or exporting with a free trade country, you're not going to have taxes, or perhaps the taxes will be greatly reduced. Not to mention other type of customs and border crossing barriers. So there's a bit of, again, a logistical leapfrog if you can arrange for your component products and then final assembled products to come from free trade areas and to export those out to free trade areas, then you can reduce down the amount of taxes. So maybe you're buying your component products from a number of different free trade area countries, assembling in a free port, and then you export them to other free trade countries. You've just eliminated almost all of your taxes, perhaps, by doing that logistical supply chain, piggybacking on free trade areas and free trade zones, export processing zones, bonded warehouses, and all of that to develop your supply side, manufacturing side, with reducing or eliminating taxes for importation, exportation of goods. Okay. Let's talk a little bit now about some other issues involving importing and exporting that you need to be aware about. So from a contractual standpoint, one of the issues with international trade is the currency exchange. And so this can obviously fluctuate greatly on a day-to-day basis, depending on what's going on in the currency markets and elsewhere within the world. And so, for example, perhaps I'm entering into a contract, I'm going to be buying wheat or corn or whatever product it is over a period of years, perhaps, from a supplier, a farmer, or whatever. And we're going to agree on a price, so I can do forecasting. And the issue is, what happens if we have, number one, a drastic change? Let's say the initial order is for $1 million worth of corn and $1 million each year for 5 years of corn. Well, what if the exchange rate changes drastically? So perhaps one denomination, one currency goes way up and the other goes way down. And we want to try to benefit both sides by having an ability within a contract to modify the actual price depending on where the exchanges are between the currencies. So this is called a maintenance of value clause. This is a paragraph within a contract that would allow for adjusting of the contract price at the time of the transaction, which may depend upon inflation, consumer price or wholesale price or producer price indexes, or other type of measurements, which may include the use of what's called a currency basket. This is an index of various currencies like the euro, the dollar, the pound sterling for the UK. So one of these is called an SDR, which is part of the International Monetary Fund, and this is a group of, next page over, SDR. This is like an index, kind of like the Consumer Price Index. It's an index of currencies that can be used as a baseline to determine when a price change for a maintenance of value clause in your contract may kick in. So this is under the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and this is a basket that they maintain on their website. You can look it up, of what the relative value of these currencies are, and they essentially average them out. So, for example, the British pound may constitute 11%, the euro 31%, the yen 14%, US dollar 44%, and these do change. And so that establishes an index. So let's just say that at the time that we enter into a contract a year ago, the SDR was 1-to-1, and now 1-to-1 of the US dollar perhaps, and now the SDR was 1.5-to-1. So then we would modify our contract by perhaps 15%. So that's one way that you, in a sales contract, might incorporate this type of language to help mitigate the possibility of wide fluctuations of currencies. And so, it benefits both parties in a way because it's maintaining that stability, that price stability. Okay, the next issue to be aware of is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA. This is the United States federal law that essentially, in a nutshell, makes it illegal to engage or utilize bribery or other type of similar tactics in engaging in international trade, negotiating for contracts, and that sort of thing. It's very detailed. I'm not really going to get into all the detail in this class, but essentially, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes this unlawful to bribe a foreign governmental official to obtain or retain business. And this applies to essentially any individual, employee, officer, corporation that's engaged in international transactions. Now, there are some areas that are flat out prohibited, like an actual bribe, and there are other areas where it gets into a bit of a gray zone. So for example, if I am going to another country, I'm trying to negotiate a sales contract, and perhaps I take out the representatives from the company I'm negotiating with. I take them out to dinner and a show or whatever, entertainment. Is that a bribe or is that marketing? What is that? And so it gets to be kind of a gray area in that respect, and it can be very detailed. This is especially important for all size companies, but especially in larger companies where you're going to want to have very transparent and published policy within your company on what constitutes prohibited type of marketing or other type of activity to avoid getting into this bribery area. This is also a constantly evolving area of law because as events happen, we may have court decisions and other precedent that changes on what constitutes an act of bribery. There are also safe harbors, meaning there are areas that are deemed safe, like obtaining permits through an official government agency that are the normal type of permits that anybody would have to get. That's a clearly allowable situation and not going to be considered a bribe. And there are other areas where there are basically safety areas that are allowable. And again, it gets very detailed beyond the scope of this class. I just want you to be aware of it if you're engaged in any kind of international trade. This is where U.S. federal law actually can even apply outside the United States. If you are under the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning you're a U.S.-based company or you do business within the United States, this law can be made to apply outside of the United States to even foreign transactions. Okay, and finally for this section, we're going to talk just real briefly about the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, which is abbreviated as CISG. This essentially is a convention, a large treaty, and the idea behind this convention, this treaty, is to basically provide for default language for an international sales contract for countries that are part of the convention. And so the